Can you hear us okay? You can nod your head, yes or no. You can hear? All right, fantastic. See, that's that trick. I have you on mute. So welcome. I'm Abby Noy-Schuff, the Extension Educator. And with me today, I have Dr. Sally Noll. And right now there's an audience of one, but this is being recorded. And so we will post it on the YouTube channel for further viewing down the road and for any questions that other producers might have down the road. So just to get your bearings a little bit with how Zoom works, if you hover over the bottom, you'll be able to access the chat. And I do have that open. And at any time you can enter the chat. From there, you would also be able to raise your hand. We will take a few breaks, hesitations, and turn off your mute if you have any questions too. So let's go ahead and get started. So Sally, take it away.
Okay, I'll take the mouse there. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope you'll be able to get some useful information out of this this presentation. And for those of you who might not know me, I'm Sally Noll. I work at the University of Minnesota here, and I'm a poultry extension specialist. And my contact information, the easiest way to get a hold of me is via email, and that's on the slide there. So today we're going to be talking about delayed placement, or the other flip way to look at it, or the other flipping it around a little bit would be to talk more about how early feed access can help turkey performance. And so in my talk today then, we'll be doing a brief introduction and then move towards some of the research that's been done with turkeys. And then recently as well, there's been a lot of interesting publications that have started to actually summarize. And so we're getting a pretty good picture of what's going on as poults hatch, between the time period that poults hatch and as they get placed in that initial 3 to 4 days after placement. So from the standpoint of the research that's out there, early feed access has been shown to be beneficial, and this is kind of true across many different types of poultry. Some of the problems in demonstrating the effect of either delayed placement or early feed access is a little bit difficult, just because timing of placement after the hatches can be often variable out in the field. And then the other thing that we run into is how best to define that delay or that time to feed access. So one way would be to talk about it from a biological age standpoint. That would actually start with the time of hatch. So obviously, if you have a lot of eggs that are hatching at one time, it's difficult to pinpoint when each poult has actually hatched in that. And so that's when collecting information on the hatch window becomes valuable in this type of data. The other way to look at it, which I think is how a lot of publications do it, is by chronological age. That basically says, okay, the time or the age starts, at the time that the hatch is polled, and then time periods after that will be in relationship to that time point. So is early feed access important? Well, over time anyways, sometimes when I've talked to people about this, there's some common opinions that seem to come out. And one is that we know that birds and poultry, they maintain, or they do have a yolk sac that's present, left over from the embryonic development. And so there's a common opinion that yolk sac over the 3 days after hatch will take and support until feed can be provided. But a lot of the research that's out there is starting to show that basically yolk sac provides very minimal nutrition and very minimal energy. So it's more just kind of a way to somewhat maintain the bird until it can get on feed. The other thing is that the yolk sac size at hatch can be variable. So we're not always quite for sure just how much of a yolk sac is available to each individual poult. And then on the flip side of things, we actually find that the utilization of the material that's in the yolk sac is actually improved when the birds are actually feeding. And that's when you'll get your most rapid decrease in yolk sac size, and eventually regressing totally. the other thing that you sometimes hear as well is the delayed placement, the negative effects might be relatively short term if they're there, and that anything that might be going on, there might be a time for compensatory growth or some kind of recovery to occur that then won't affect the bird won't affect the bird to market. It should be performing the same. However, again, looking at the literature in that, there's a lot of variable responses, and you also have to have the environment and the conditions in order for that recovery to occur with minimal disease challenge, as we'll be talking about later on here. And then for turkeys, the situation isn't quite as clear because there's actually, at least from the standpoint of publications anyways, very few studies that have looked at the impact of delayed placement to market age. So when we're defining that time period, we have to think about it from the standpoint of what's going on during the hatching time period. And as I mentioned already, there's that hatch window. And for turkeys anyways, that'll be somewhere around 30 to 40 hours that the majority of the poults will be hatching in that time frame. Then there's also holding or processing at the hatchery as well, and then a holding period before the birds are removed and transported to the farm. In some cases, transport can also be quite long depending upon the distances, and I think this is a little bit more problematic for the turkey industry than what it is for the chicken industries. But we also have that time spent on the truck as well. And then eventually the birds are placed on the farm and the brooding phase begins. So if we look at that whole cycle, those times can start to extend from the initial poults at hatch all the way out to the farm, then that we can start to see sometimes where, it might be closer to 50, 60 hours that before they have access to feed. So is poultry performance affected with the delay in feed access? It's not a real simple question to answer, so it's not strictly a yes or no. A recent paper divided some of the effects up very nicely into both short-term effects and long-term effects. And from their studies anyways, when they were doing their comparisons, and this was actually digging into the literature, and I think they utilized about 50 publications and summarized those in this particular one publication. But basically the short-term effects with feed access 12 to 36 hours post-hatch lasted for about a week when compared to early feed access. And so basically they saw some lowered body weight and feed intake. They also saw some reduced growth of the intestinal tract, both the length and the weight of the tract, and then also some reduced organ weights. In this case, they were looking at the heart, liver, and pancreas, all very important in terms of supporting growth of the baby turkeys. From a long-term effect, though, then, and this is primarily from chicken data, broiler chicken data, they did see still a carryover effect with decreased body weights and feed intakes to 6 weeks of age. So for that post-hatch time period before feed access in the range of 24 to 72 hours, basically the body weight range at 6 weeks of age, then for the longer time periods of delayed placement was 92% of the control, and then up to 97% with the 24-hour post-hatch placement. So despite some feeling, that the birds are able to recover and regain and grow to their potential anyways, there still is, at least based on this study, a negative impact of having that delay in feed access. So what's happening during that time period then before the poults or chicks are placed on feed? And what are the impacts of that? So the intestine actually initially is one of the fastest growing organs in the bird after the time of hatch once they're placed on feed. And that's because it's very important. I mean, if we're not getting the digestion and absorption, we're not going to be able to grow the skeleton. We're not going to be able to grow muscles and so forth. So when the birds aren't eating, then the intestine itself can't grow. We won't get the nutrient absorption. There's actually some functionality, functional things that go on in terms of reduced expression of nutrient transporters in the gut. We're also concerned about what kind of bacterial colonization we're going to be having. And then satellite cell development tends to be suppressed, which will eventually affect meat yield. And it's really the presence of feed in the gut itself that stimulates gut development, so that development isn't going to occur unless we have some kind of eating activity and food in the gut. Sometimes we get kind of focused on the fact about nutrient levels, nutrient intake, and absorption, and we kind of forget about the immune system. And actually the intestine and the associated organs along with that play a major role in terms of the immune system of the bird, which kind of makes sense because a lot of pathogens come in through oral inoculation. And so there's, we can get impaired, what we call GALT development for the first 2 weeks. And the GALT stands for gut-associated lymphoid tissue, which for a lot of people probably are familiar with the bursa fabricius. And when they're off feed for a period of time, initially like that, where the delay in the development of that lymphoid tissue anyways appears to be mostly in the hindgut of the bird, and particularly in the bursa as well. The thing to keep in mind is that the development of the intestine kind of runs concurrently with the development of the immune system. And the immune system also needs its nutrients and energy in order to take and develop. So again, if there's lack of nutrients, no food, and that's going to take and restrict the development of the immune system. So again, from a functionality standpoint, we end up with lower disease resistance. So it is a challenge to look at these things and try to determine what the actual impact is. There like an optimal time after hatch, for poults to be placed. Some of the things that you run into with some of the different research studies, and that would be, what kind of poultry type are being studied, what are the genetic lines influences, what's the parent stock age, because we know these things all can take and impact egg composition as well as egg size. Different hatching times, different hatching profiles and that. And that's all of this is even before we take and place birds on the farm. And then we run into other things such as environment or behavioral responses too. So sometimes it is difficult to say, okay, is there an optimal time or are we just trying to avoid extended time periods before the birds get feed? Another interesting paper just recently came out as well, talking about some interventions. We have to assume that there's always going to be some delay in getting birds, and I don't want to say delay, it's just part of the natural timing and schedule of the system between hatching and transport and getting the poults out to the farm. And so are there some things that we can do to try to mitigate or minimize, the effect of that time off of feed? And so there are some things such as in ovo feeding, really nice from the standpoint of being able to target specific nutrients or additives. Sometimes supplements at transport or placement are used to try to give that birds a little bit of hydration and some energy. Some of the things I've been involved with a little bit earlier is looking at early feed formulation, pre-starter type diet where we're trying to get to ingredients that are highly digestible, other components that might be in there that provide a lot of energy, as well as maybe jumpstart the gut in terms of its development. And then from feed additives, there's, it's a little bit hard to even say much of a comment about that because there's so many out there. And I think a lot of things are still being sorted out about what are beneficial and what might be of more value later on. And then, of course, on the farm, what can we do from a management standpoint in terms of preparing for placement as well as the brooding process in that? And there's a number of things that are listed here. Obviously, if the birds aren't comfortable in their space and there might be some feed quality issues potentially, or there might be some accessibility issues to get to the feeders and waters. Even though the feed is there anyways, they might not have the feed intake that they should have. So that's one of my comments, and I think it's actually an area that we need to do some additional studies on as we talk about feed access, but we really a lot of times don't have a good handle on whether the birds are actually feeding the way that they should be. So again, a lot of studies are talking about now they have access to the feed, but what's not well documented is how well the birds actually get started on feeding then after placement. So back to the topic at hand. It's been a while since I actually asked the question here, can delayed placement hurt turkey performance? And so I think I might have mentioned there's very limited studies with turkeys. Probably one of the more recent ones was out of Iowa State in 1999. And here they were looking at hen turkey poults, and basically the body weight was 85% of the control at 4 weeks of age with a 54-hour post-hatch. And similar to the paper I cited before, they also noted the temporary reductions in intestinal and organ weights as well. Unfortunately, their study ended at 4 weeks of age, and so there was no further information on what impact that might have had on the birds as they grew older. With my group here at the University of Minnesota, we've been looking at a couple of studies with tom poults. And one study was with poults in cages that went to 17 days of age. And then the second study, we actually, we had birds in a barn bedded with shavings, and then they were growing out to 17 weeks of age, so we could try to assess that carryover effect of delayed placement to a market weight. So for study one then, we kind of estimated about a 6-hour time period from the time that the hatch was pulled to when we actually got the birds at the farm and got them placed. And so 6 hours post-hatch, pulling of the hatch anyways, is our control group. And then we had 30 hours where they were held without feed and water, and then 54 hours where they were held without feed and water. And so relative to for the body weight at 17 days of age, for the intermediate holding time, the birds were at 97% of the control, but definitely reduced in body weight at 50 hours holding time, then being at 89% of the control. We also saw reduced organ weights as well, gizzard size, pancreas, and bursa. Probably more disconcerting was probably the bursa to 11 days of age, even though the birds would have been on feed by that time by about 9 days or so. Increased yolk sac weight to 4 days of age when the birds were being held off feed for a longer period of time. Kind of supports the earlier statement that yolk utilization actually occurs at a much faster rate when the birds are on feed. Surprisingly, we had some increased intestinal length when this was put on a relative per unit basis. And I think, again, it's just an emphasis from the birds, that intestine has to get started to grow in that in order to take and support the growth of the rest of the bird. Okay, in study 2, where we did go out to market weight, so in this case, we only had the two treatments, our control at 6 hours post-hatch, and then the extended time period of 54 hours post-hatch. And at 3 weeks of age, again, similar to the previous study, body weights were reduced to 84% of the control. And then at 6 weeks of age, there was a little bit of recovery going on, and relative body weight at that point in time was 93%. We also noted an increase in runts in that extended placement group, with about 4% runts at 6 weeks of age. So again, I think if you have some younger some weaker birds potentially in that, and then you have that extended holding time in that they tend not to really recover and grow very well. So we did measurements of body weight at 17 weeks of age and 2 days of age. And we actually got a fairly large difference. And I just noticed here I have a little bit of an error in terms of how these are labeled. It should have been 6 hours and 48 hours. My apologies for that. But basically, at that point in time, we had almost a pound live weight difference between those birds, the ones that were put on feed 6 hours after hatching versus the ones were put on feed and water 54 hours after hatching. So a pretty quick calculation, at 50 cents a pound for live weight, 10,000 birds, you're losing a little bit of money this way. Okay, so delayed placement. Recap. At 3 weeks of age, we had the greatest percentage of lowered body weight. At 6 weeks of age, we did have some recovery in the body weight of the birds, but we started to notice more runts being present. At market age, it seems fairly, 98% recovery seems pretty good, except that when we look at what that poundage is actually in the barn at that time, so a difference in 1 pound for those birds at about 40 pounds of body weight. We also noted the decreased, again, weights of the bursa, gizzard, and spleen, and yolk sacs were not utilized as efficiently when off feed. And then we also had the situation of the length of the intestine relative to the body weight increasing. So similar to chickens, post-hatch delays in placement resulted in lowered body weights, although there was some recovery after 3 weeks of age, but it still amounted to a significant decrease in body weight. And that important organ weights, such as the gizzard, pancreas, bursa, were reduced in that first week of post-hatch. So some other considerations: is there an optimal time to place chickens, turkeys after hatch? So there's another more recent paper that kind of suggested, at least from an intestinal development system, that 4 hours might be optimal, although this was shown in broilers and they didn't use turkeys as part of their model. The other thing is behavior considerations. We do know that there are differences in behavior of turkey poults immediately after hatch, and then as time goes on, that may relate back to how much activity there is at placement and how much feeding might be initiated. So that's definitely an area I think that needs to be looked at a little bit closer as well. So in conclusion, the short-term effects of 54 hours post-hatch placement were similar to that previously reported. In this particular study, that we did get a difference at time of market, which is economically important. But what we don't know, what is unknown, would be the long-term impact on bird health and other physiological measurements of well-being. I think we've got a pretty good handle on organ weights and some of the gut functionality in that, but there's a lot of other challenges that could occur out in the field that might actually accentuate these differences that we're seeing in a research setting. So let's see, acknowledgements for funding anyways, our experiment station and USDA, and my staff and students in the Turkey Research Lab, and Abby Noll for her help here with the presentation, and many other things. So, thank you.